I'd like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Parker. Dr. Sarah Parker joined us just this past year. When did you come?
August.
In August, that's right. August 3rd was supposed to be your first day. And she joined VTCRI, and she's doing a whole bunch of really cool things over there. Human factors research, working with the biomedical sciences folks, the QI folks, so all over the place. And she's a wonderful person with whom to collaborate and find out more about what you can do with your research. So today she's here, and she's sort of going to be presenting a lot more, I hope, of these research topics. But we're going to start out today having her talk about how to write up your research, how to get going, because sometimes stuff is just so sitting in your cabinet drawer and just waiting for you to do something with it. So I'll let Sarah tell you a little bit more about what she does and then get started. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward actually to having this conversation, because just putting together this presentation really inspired me to pull some stuff actually out of my desk drawer. As Sherry said, I just moved here from Washington, D.C. I was at MedStar Health in D.C. working in their National Center for Human Factors in Healthcare. And I realized when I was packing up and moving, I just take this one folder of like to be written research projects and just move it from location to location. And sometimes I'll move it to this section of my desk, and sometimes I'll scooch it to the center, and then I'll just scooch it back to the side. And so it was actually really good to kind of start thinking about this a little bit more. My hope is that this is a really kind of a practical and helpful presentation. I also am fearful that it's too basic. I know I'm in a room, I'm seeing folks that I've seen at a number of other meetings, so I hope this isn't too basic. I hope this is actually practical and useful as we go forward and talk. First I wanted to start off, when you're opening a journal or whatever, when you're looking through or on Google Scholar, what makes you actually read a full article?
Title.
I'm sorry?
The title.
The title?
Capture on.
Yeah. What else?
The abstract.
Abstract. Yeah. Anything else?
The results in the abstract.
Relevance, results in the abstract.
Whether it's full of jargon or not.
The author, that's a huge one for me. And what did you say?
Whether it's full of jargon or not.
Just the abstract, if the abstract is jargony or not? Yes, exactly. So all of these things are exactly what I look for. I look for specifically the authors. I look for me, I read a lot of articles for their method. So if their method isn't clear in the abstract, I don't read the rest. So for you all, why do you actually write an article? How many folks? I'm sorry?
Share information.
Share information.
For me, it's a process of bringing a lot of things together. When I sit down to write, I have all these files, and I start pulling it all together to get a central thought out of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's kind of an exercise in narrowing, I guess. What else? How many folks have written for peer review before? Has everybody? Okay, perfect. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, you put all this work into doing something and then sort of examining it, analyzing it, and then you just know you've got to get it out there.
Yeah, after all that work. Yeah, absolutely. So think about the best articles that you've read. Are there seminal articles just for you as an individual, maybe not necessarily your field, but seminal articles that you've read? What are there particular things about those articles that stick out to you?
Their structure, the flow of them. I can tell I'm on a good article when they're moving me through their process to their results.
That's a great point.
Like a story.
Yeah.
I think it's so much more helpful when it's clear. It's like a story as opposed to, super high level esoteric terms.
Like you were saying, jargon or
Yeah. a lot of jargon in it.
Yeah.
It sort of depends on whether it's a research article, original article, or a review of something. At least in the stuff that I read clinically.
Say more. What do you mean?
Pardon?
Say more. What are you looking for in these different things?
If it's a review article, I want it to actually be readable. I'm willing to set aside, easy readability if it seems as if it's a research article that addresses something I'm interested in.
Huh. Yeah, so you're forgiving, you're kind of weighting things one or the other. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, some of it's discipline specific, like looking at the discussion and conclusion or further steps, that it's a holistic reflection on where the holes are in the research. Because I feel like some of the ones that aren't seminal are the ones that just say, well, we didn't do this well, or, our subject, our end wasn't large enough.
Yeah.
Not looking at the larger picture.
Yeah.
And then helping novice researchers learn what should we do next.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it motivates me to do something.
Those are the best articles.
I practice to implement a similar study, say, oh, I want to pick this piece out and do something with that here. So it has to motivate me to do something.
That's a great point, and that's a combination of actual writing and method and things like that. Any other things? When, for those of you who have written for peer review, when do you start thinking about your write-up?
At the beginning of the project.
At the beginning of the project? Did somebody else say something?
Oh, as soon as you find out you're gonna, know about the project.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you start thinking about at that point? Like, what are the things that are just percolating at those early stages?
Other than like the lit review and the methods and stuff like that.
No, those are the things. Yep. Anything else? So, thanks for the segue. So one of the most important things when you're starting your project, I completely agree. I think you got to start thinking about your write-up absolutely immediately. And I think one of the most important things to do, obviously, is go back to the literature. It helps you, obviously, put your work into context. But one of the things that I've noticed a number of times, and this comes from advising students, but also in reading colleagues' work, everybody thinks that they are having this original idea, right? And I've actually reviewed grants where I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know much about this topic. And then I just go and Google Scholar it, and the first 3 articles that pop up, and you're like, oh boy, that was a lot of work you went to for me to actually have to reject this outright. So I think that although this sounds basic and cursory, is so important to remember. Again, the other thing that I read for in almost all articles that I read is particularly for method. I am a social scientist by training, but I write, and I've published exclusively in clinical journals. So I'm trying to speak my language kind of to clinicians, or I'm trying to speak clinician with psych method. And so trying to write appropriately for journals that are potentially out with your discipline is something that's really, really important. And then the other thing for in terms of publication is wherever you're reading these articles are probably more likely to publish your stuff. So for example, for me, the American Journal of Surgery publishes a lot about team performance, leadership, things like that. So I often will target them if I have an article that's particular for that kind of stuff, because I know they will accept it, and not all surgical journals want to talk about teamwork and leadership, and that's my area. So I think just to kind of get us all on the same page, there's a lot of different types of research that is being published, particularly in healthcare journals. Obviously, you've got your kind of standard randomized control trials, kind of heavier on the quantitative side, both experimental and quasi-experimental, but also there's more of a shift now towards a number of journals that are starting to publish rigorous but qualitative studies, as well as mixed methods studies. Are folks familiar with mixed methods, where you're kind of taking part quantitative, part qualitative, and pulling them together? This is just kind of starting to become more and more familiar in the healthcare literature, which is great for me because that's the world that I live in, so I'm so pleased. But the idea is that you take multiple different methods and you kind of focus on triangulating your results. So for example, I do a focus group, and then I actually test an intervention in a surgical suite or something like that. So you're kind of taking a multi-step process. This is fairly familiar in the psychological literature, in the sociological literature, but it's definitely something that's kind of coming along in the healthcare literature. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is there's a lot of different applications that can be published in the healthcare literature. So not just things about evidence-based medicine, best practice, new innovations, but also medical education, patient safety, team performance, all of these things happening within healthcare. Healthcare is a really unique application environment. And more studies are being published that are testing different medical education interventions, for example, in healthcare, or different patient safety interventions applied within the healthcare domain. So here is where much research ends up. This is about the most professorial office I could find. There's a TV from like 1912 and like, you know, not that clean of a desk. And my concern is that, like Sherry said, we do so much good, hard, rigorous work to try and test new interventions that for you all, test things that are actually going to help patients, and it ends up hanging out in that desk drawer because of this difficulty in writing it up. I think one of the things to debunk is scientific writing doesn't equal super complex nonsensical stuff, right? It doesn't equal jargon. A good scientific article leads you down the path of how did they get to this final finding. Jargon doesn't equal good article. So I was trying to think about if jargon doesn't equal good article, then what are other reasons that papers are rejected? The appropriateness of the journal chosen is one of the most important things. So making sure, for example, that your type of research is published by this type of journal is really, really important. Again, I can come back to myself. So teamwork stuff is, unless it is like the world's best study, is not published in Annals of Surgery. So I can go to Annals of Surgery and get a really good rejection. And sometimes it's really helpful because they have great reviewers. So you get a lot of good advice, and sometimes that's worth the wait. But it's going to get rejected. So you're kind of waiting what you're doing with your work. Papers get rejected, obviously, if the research is seriously flawed. So there's a writing issue here, and then there's also an actual doing of research. If your doing of research is seriously flawed, I don't know where you're going to get it published. That's an issue. You should probably redo your project. From the writing side, the macro aspects of writing, such as organization, logic, flow, all of those kinds of things, they call it reader burden. So if you are making it hard for your reviewer to review your paper, it's more likely to get rejected. If I have to work and look stuff up and Google your method and do all that kind of stuff, I'm very happy to do that. But once I've done that, I'm one of those dangerous not experts who knows just enough to be hypercritical. So if you can lay that out for me in your method, it's much, much easier. I believe that you know what you're doing now. Does that kind of make sense? Micro aspects of writing. Another thing as a reviewer that for me kills a paper is when it has grammar mistakes, all that kind of stuff. Do other folks review and find this? Okay. It just kills it for me because it's like you didn't even have time to proofread. Now do I believe your method? I don't know. Terrible diagrams. Terrible diagrams take away. If I have to spend loads of time trying to understand your diagram, again, that'll make me less likely to kind of push your paper through. If your diagram is super important, make it such that, this is an information visualization problem almost. How do you make your information as readily usable to your reader as possible? I feel like diagrams, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but diagrams I think are one of the most important parts of your paper. They help show exactly what you're trying to tell. And so if your diagrams don't do that for you, it makes it really hard, I think, for your reviewers to accept your paper. There's the little baby steps like following instructions for authors. The instructions for authors are super detailed. And again, it's one of those things where if somebody has cited in Vancouver versus citing in APA format, depending on what the instructions for authors say, I'm going to start to be more critical. Do folks find this when you're reviewing? If somebody doesn't follow, I mean, for grants, for example, if you don't follow the instructions for authors, that's a desk rejection. That's easy for the reviewer. So this is one of those little things that's really easy to overlook, but really, really important. The APA had this really lovely sentence that I thought was nice. It's sufficiently important and free from flaws to justify publication. That's their criteria. Sufficiently important and free from flaws. I think at the same time that you are starting to think about your write-up so early in your study, I think potentially then is a time to start thinking about which journal you're going to target. It's really hard to write something and then look for a journal because journals have such wide variation in what they want and require. So for example, BMJ Quality and Safety, their articles are like 2,500 words. I mean, they're short. They're super, super short. Whereas, for example, Journal of Applied Psychology, they want articles that are like 4 billion words long, approximately. So if I write it's hard. You just avoid yourself doing a lot of rework if you target your journal early. You know what they want. You know, for example, am I the only psychologist in the room? Is everybody clinical? Okay, so for folks who are not clinical, for example, psychology journals want you to write, they want you to write, published in previous research by Parker et al. In a study with 37 undergraduates showed that blah, 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 blah. Medical journals want you to say, as seen by Parker et al. That's it. And so tailoring your writing particular to your journal is one of those things. And you get it from reading lots of journal articles. You get quickly what people want. I think in trying to identify a target journal, figure out where you cite, where you read. What journals do you actually use in your practice? Those are places where you probably want to start to target. Impact factor, folks are familiar with impact factor? It kind of it's an odd formula. I tried to look it up and I was going to include it and then I was like, I don't get it. So it's some way that articles that are cited are weighted in some way. I'll show you next. The other special thing, the other thing that might be helpful is this idea of special calls. So journals often have special calls. For example, on like social network analysis, a journal like PLOS ONE has a call for papers on social network analysis. That makes it much easier for my paper on social network analysis in healthcare to get published there. So if you look, you can actually Google special calls and it'll pop up. You can find a number of things that are happening in journals from multiple domains. It just increases the likelihood that your stuff will get in under a special call. And so here's impact factor information. So for example, New England Journal of Medicine has a 51 impact factor. Cell has a 31. Probably a human factors journal for me is like a negative 0.02, but that's cool. So if you want your stuff to be widely read, you may or may not want to look at impact factor. I don't know if folks also need to worry about academic promotion and tenure, but for people who are doing research, sometimes now actually on your CVs, you'll see people will cite, you know, I wrote my article, it was published here, and the impact factor of this journal is blah. So. Yeah, if you weren't.
Yearly, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And where do you get it? It's through the library, it's subscription based, isn't it?
And you can also find it on any of your journals. So if you go to like JAMA's website, it will say impact factor right at the top.
Sarah, Digital Measures is now asking for impact factor. There's a
Okay.
piece to that. So if you're entering your information into Digital Measures,
Yay, good times, yeah.
Isn't that a double-edged sword, though? I mean, the journal with the higher impact factor is going to be much more competitive
Yep.
in terms of trying to get...
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so, for example, I think this is, I think you kind of have to be thoughtful in how you target. So if I want a high impact factor, for example, JAMA or something like that, I know JAMA turns stuff around. They desk reject almost everything. So you will, if I send something to JAMA, it is positive in that if they are going to reject it, they will at least do it quickly and not hold on to my article for 3 months. If it potentially gets published in JAMA, that's huge. So I think you're weighting how much time do you want to wait for your journal or for your article to get turned around. And then for example, for someplace like Annals of Surgery, the reviewers are excellent. So by the time it gets rejected, for me, by the time my article gets rejected from Annals of Surgery, and then I've rewritten it to help with those reviewers' comments, it's actually way better than it was the first time and potentially could get into Annals of Surgery, but it's already been rejected. So I think you're kind of going about this tactically, right? I think you're right, it is a double-edged sword, but you've got to be tactical in where you put your article.
And don't be frightened away by lower impact factors, like
It's not bad.
said, human factors, super low. Medical education, like we're super excited if we get an impact factor of 2 or something like that. So
And that's the other thing is impact factors overall. This is like across all different journals. Impact factors, so if you just look at journals within medical education is one of the top journals, you know, followed by medical teacher and academic medicine. Academic medicine is probably the top, but so within your field, you can kind of narrow down your impact factors as well. Are folks familiar with instructions for authors? Okay, so on any time you're submitting your article, there's always instructions for authors on that journal's website. Follow them as much as you can. No, just follow them. Not as much as you can. You have to follow them. End of story. So just look for them. And this is more for, this particular slide is for folks who have never written up anything before. I had no idea the first article that I published that there was a this. So just nobody had ever told me. So I wanted to share that with you. Identifying authors. This is much trickier than you think it would be. Do folks have experience? Kind of, has anybody ever had a trouble with it? Maybe you guys are better at this than me. So, for example, you have a group of people working together to do a research project, and you are finally to the point where you're writing it up. At this point, I think you need to have a conversation about who is writing up the paper. So there's things that matter in healthcare are the first author and usually the senior author. So the first author is that person who has done the majority of the work, who has done the majority of the writing. The senior author is often the person who got the funding or the most senior person on the project. It kind of depends. And so in terms of, again, for promotion, for tenure, for your review by your department head, first author articles matter a lot, and then senior articles matter a lot. There are really nice author guidelines if you ever get into a position where you have to have some sort of conversation with your co-authors. For example, recently, one of my students, we had talked about him being the co-author on the paper, and he dropped the ball in a number of ways, and another student really took it on. And so I felt ethically that we needed to have a conversation where you can't be the first author anymore because you haven't done the work. This person has done the work. And having that conversation after you've already had the first conversation is hard. So I think making it super clear from the ICMJE, the medical editors, making it super clear what the expectations are of the first, second, third, etc., just makes that conversation easier and faster if you have it early, and then it makes it clear if you're the first author, you're doing this, etc. So traditional format for an article, this shouldn't come as a shock to anybody. I'm going to dive into a few of these. I did want to talk a little bit about the order of reading versus the order of writing. So it's very, very appealing as a reader, as we spoke about, to have somebody really walk you through, okay, here's the bigger picture, and here's our particular study, and here's why it matters, etc. In terms of writing, this is how I do it, and this is how I think it works the best. So I think if you start with your figures and tables, and start with that data, and try and figure out what is this data telling me? What is the result that I want to highlight? That makes it fall out faster. So if you start with figures and tables, figure out what's interesting, and then kind of work backward from there. I think the method is quite easy because it's just a factual statement of what you did, and it's a really nice early win. You feel very good that you've written a bit of your paper. So, and then the results, again, this is just kind of a limited interpretation. This is where you're going to be presenting those figures and tables. So if you've got your figures and tables figured out and you know what the thing is that you want to highlight, the results flow very quickly. The intro and discussion, I find these are the hardest things to write because you need to cite properly, you need to think about the logic, etc. But if you've done these other things and you know where you want to go, that the intro and discussion I think are easier. And then I write the abstract last, personally. Do other folks have different methods or tips or tricks that they use for this kind of thing? Yeah.
The only exception is when you're trying to make a poster deadline before you do the submission and it's abstract.
That's fair. That's fair. Yep.
Then you just do the abstract first.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody, anything else? Any other words of wisdom? One of my mentors told me this stuff when I was first writing papers, and this was really, really helpful to me as a student trying to really think about how to write my papers. So your intro is why I did this, method is how, results is what I found that's meaningful, and discussion is what I think it means and implications. So why, what, why does it actually matter, and then how does it matter in a larger sense? And this makes it feel less intimidating to me, I guess, as a writer. Just a couple of points about style. When we're talking about writing for peer review, formality is really, really important. So there's scientific language versus kind of standard language. This is something that I see often in my students, where they're very willing to use kind of that informal language. And writing scientifically is a significant skill. Figuring out how to use those, and sometimes it seems unnecessary to use complex words for actually simple things. But part of scientific writing is precision, and that's what the formality of the language gives you. For example, saying something like we versus the authors, those are kind of different style things that you need to make kind of choices about. Accuracy and clarity with your writing. Again, I wanted to come back to grammar. There are standards of reporting for randomized control trials and drug intervention trials, these PRISMA and consort things. There are standard ways of kind of reporting out this information, and so if you happen to be writing an article that involves those things, look those up. Some journals, most journals, if they want that, will say in their instructions for authors, but I just wanted to make sure folks were aware. Yeah, please.
Versus the authors, like academic medicine, I believe, they want first person
for abstracts and then third person for the
active
article.
and
Yep.
not passive voice.
Yep.
And
That's another question.
specific, but then you go over to med teach or medical science educator, and they want it a different way. So, we flex between those, and that's where the thing for the author
Yeah.
becomes real.
Absolutely, absolutely. So another way to kind of think about this is an hourglass. Your paper is kind of an hourglass. So you're trying to put it in the context of the larger literature, and then particularly your topic area, and your study is the thinnest part of this hourglass. And then, so this is kind of your intro, and then your study, your methods, your discussion, your results, and then impact on the topic area. Why does this actually matter? And then a larger contribution. What difference does this make in a kind of a bigger way? So when you're thinking about writing, it kind of helps you think broad to narrow, back to broad. So your title and abstract, we kind of said this. This is one of the things that's the most widely read about your paper, so it matters. I think there's sometimes folks who really want to come up with a kind of a sexy, fun title, and sometimes I think that's cool, and sometimes I think it doesn't actually tell you what the article is about, so you dismiss it. I don't know. I don't know where people fall down on that. I tend to err on the side of concise, because I know that's where somebody is deciding whether or not to read the rest of the paper. And then I wanted to make the point about abstracts. Some abstracts for some journals, again, this is in your instructions for authors, will be highly, highly structured. So they want background, 2 sentences, method, blah, blah, results. Some don't, it's unstructured 300 words. So just be aware that different journals have different requirements. In your intro, I think the main things that you're wanting to hit are what is your question and why does it matter within this context of the larger literature? What is the gap that you are trying to fill with your study? And so I don't want to conflate this talk with a grant writing talk, but I think in your introduction, stating super clearly, the purpose of this study is blah. The gap that we are filling is blah. Like, no need to make it a mystery. You know, no need to make this a thing to figure out. Your introduction also will differ depending on whether you are looking at a general versus a specialist journal. So for example, if I'm writing something for JAMA, which has a broad audience, versus if I'm writing something for American Journal of Surgery. 2 very different audiences. They will require different things of the introduction. An excellent introduction makes your reader think, gosh, this question is super important, and the only way one could answer it is by doing blah. And then they read the first sentence of the method and they're like, I'm a genius, they're doing blah. So that I think that's hard to do, but that's what you're going for with your intro. You are leading that reader to your method, to believing that this is an important question to answer. I don't want it to make it seem like the intro is exclusively a marketing document, but it is a little bit. It's in part helping the reader down the path, but you are using evidence to do so. Your method. The purpose of writing a method is allowing others to replicate, allowing people to evaluate your study. So the level of detail of your method can vary. So for example, if you're using something that is super standard in your field and you are writing for a specialist journal, you may not need to go to a high level of detail. If you are writing something that is a brand new method or may not be familiar to this audience, you need a different level of detail. So if I'm writing something about a qualitative analysis for a surgical journal or a mixed methods analysis for a healthcare journal, I will go into more detail than I would in potentially a different journal. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words here. I really think pictures are your best friends here. I think this is where you need to use your figures really appropriately. So this is a study that they had 2 different, it was a randomized control trial, and I felt like this diagram just helped me immediately understand. They had 2 groups. This was the control group. This is what happened at the end of the analysis. They had 22 people included. At the end of the analysis, in the experimental group, they had 25. Like, they could have written that, and it would have been fine, but I could just see it in the diagram, and that's much easier. This is just an information presentation tactic, and also a word count tactic. So,
I have a question about
yeah,
that.
please.
If you do put these things through like an algorithm, is it necessary to go through and write it as well, so that if they don't look at one, they get it from the other? Or I haven't run into this with many nursing journals, but in medical journals, do those words count towards your word count?
Usually figures and tables don't count, but it may depend on it depends on the journal. I would say that you need to complement it with text. Obviously, but you want to refer to it. So we enrolled 84 participants. They were split into a randomized and control trial group with your ends and parentheses, and then figure 1. I mean, that for me, that's what I would do. I don't know if other folks have other advice, other thoughts.
I've heard to not repeat what's in the diagram, but just sort of summarize it within your text. So you definitely don't want to duplicate.
Yeah. Some journals want subheaders for their method, pretty standard subheaders, things like participant materials, setting, and then your actual procedure. It'll say in your instructions for authors. Even if it doesn't say have a structured method, these are the 4 things that you definitely kind of want to hit when you're writing your method. You want your procedure to be detailed enough that others can replicate it. That's really, really important. So if, as a reviewer, if you are reading a paper and it's a mystery and there's no possible way I could ever replicate that in the method, I don't know if they had an awesome method and are just poor at writing, or if the method was bad. So that's why that matters. Results, here's where your figures and tables are often presented. Your results are meant to summarize findings, so just the facts. You're not supposed to do any interpretation here. You want to emphasize, in terms of a writing technique, you want to emphasize the finding, not the figure. So this also goes for grant writing as well. You don't want to say something like table 5 shows blah, blah, blah. You want to say our results show da-da-da-da-da, and then cite your figure. It's just a writing thing. You want to emphasize your finding. Tables. I was looking at different different guides for how to write research papers in preparation for this, and a couple of things that I read that I came across said tables should be standalone. I'm not sure, I hadn't read that in an instructions for authors before, but in some of the scientific writing books, that's what they said. One thing that I do know, that I have experienced a number of times in reviewing papers, is if you have a bunch of tables, for example, like table 1 in most medical papers is something about demographics, right? It's something about your study population. If table 1 and table 2 are both information about patient characteristics, but column 1 in table 1 is age, column 1 in table 2 is gender, that makes it just takes longer to interpret. So you're increasing your reader burden, which you don't want to do. So if you can make your tables such that they are the same format all the way across, that just makes it easier on your reader. They are not. You were trying to make it as easy as possible for your reader to understand exactly what you did. And to Sherry's point, you want to match your text with what's happening in the tables, but you don't want to restate what you've put in your tables. Figures, some of the things that happen with figures, just from a writing perspective, tiny, tiny, tiny font. Print out your article before you submit it. Print it out in whatever compressed PDF format the journal makes you do when you hit submit, because sometimes it will like change the formatting of your. Has anybody experienced this? Am I the only one? Yeah. And you're like, oh my gosh, this table looks like crap, and that's not positive. So ensuring that you have large enough font. The other thing to consider is color versus black and white interpretation. Most reviewers look at everything in black and white unless they look at it on a screen, and so just be aware. Titles and descriptions of your figures, figure labels, all of that kind of stuff. It's all in the instructions for authors, but you wouldn't believe, and I'm saying these things because I have reviewed papers by respected researchers that do not have this stuff in them, and it just, everything like that that's left off makes you think, why didn't they do this? Why were they lazy about this particular thing? And then if you had a doubt, you go back to it. Is that kind of making sense? So in your discussion, you want to focus on really why your results matter. And again, here is where I would recommend being extremely upfront. You don't need to bury the lead here. Our findings show blah. This is relevant because blah. I think being that upfront helps your reader. And then it helps, remember, we're thinking about this hourglass, it helps you figure out where do your results fit in the larger context of the literature. What did you add? And then explicitly go back to your intro. What was the question that I was trying to answer? Did I answer it? Did this study do that? It may, in terms of how you write, you may need to change the question in your intro, or you may need to kind of fix how you're telling your story, but you want those two things. You want it to bookend the paper really, really nicely. And then often there's a couple of throwaway paragraphs at the end of discussions on your limitations and what studies should be done next. I would argue these are not throwaway paragraphs, but often people use them as throwaway paragraphs. Asking for additional research does a couple of things. Number one, it sets you up for your next paper. You can cite yourself, which is positive, but it also shows that you actually have an understanding of what's happening in the larger literature, and you have an understanding of where the field is going. Limitations. It is really important to write your limitations and to write them thoughtfully with a little bit of rigor. If you don't mention your limitations, reviewers think that you think your paper is perfect, and I promise you it isn't. So really understanding what were the limitations of my study shows that intellectual rigor behind your study. And then the thing that I often do is, here's my limitation, here's why and how we accounted for it. Here's my limitation, here's why and how we accounted for it. Here's my limitation and why we couldn't do anything about it, and it's a limitation. Just including all of those things. I don't think you ever need to be embarrassed or bury your limitations. I think it shows that this study was done in the real world, and that's important. References, important to show that you have read and that you're not replicating something that actually you believe is novel, but it isn't. Gives others credit for all the work that they've done. That's really important as a researcher. Helping readers find further information. I do lots of hand searches of articles, so I'll go through the references and find the articles that I want to read. If I liked that article, now I want to read everything that they've read. So it helps your readers, shows how you can relate to other work. Formatting and accuracy are important. Often your article will not get rejected because you did your references poorly, but you will become best friends with the editor, the desk editor later when it's getting towards publication, because they want everything exactly right. So you're gonna have to do it now or later. May as well do it now. There are different programs. I'm sure folks have heard of EndNote. Have folks heard of Mendeley? Mendeley is great. That's what I use. It's free. I've found it to be less clunky than EndNote, particularly if you're working with collaborators. It's an online tool. I really like it personally. There's tons out there, and I'm sure everybody has their favorites that they work with. Especially the way that we do research now, where you can Google Scholar something, you can glance at it, skim the abstract. Research is at everything. Papers are at your fingertips. It's really easy to not be rigorous, to cite an article when you've just read the abstract. I'm not gonna lie, I've done that. The issue is that doesn't actually give you an accurate picture of the overall article, and so you really need to go back and actually pull the article and look at it before you cite it, because sometimes the authors of the work that you cite will be asked to review, and if you've misquoted their work, that's very bad. So just to cover yourself. So when you are at the point of submitting, you will go to the journal's website. You often have to write a cover letter. Cover letters can have varying levels of detail. So some cover letters, like if you're on your first submission, it's dear editor, name, on behalf of the authors, it's my pleasure to submit this article for your review. We look forward to your comments. Very simple. Often here is where you want to cover if you've presented this work before, because now with all of those automated like checkers where they're trying to see if you're double writing. I don't know what these things are called. What are they called?
Submitting to two journals at once?
Yeah, stuff like that, or where they're trying to see if you're like, so if you've presented something at a conference, plagiarizing, that's it. If you've submitted something at a conference and there's a conference proceedings and you're now submitting the paper, you will get like a 95% overlap in the methods, and it will come back and say, you're plagiarizing, which in reality, that's what you're trying to do because you don't want your methods to be different. But anyway, so here is the point where you want to say, this work was presented at blah, published in the proceedings, just so that it shows that you are aware. This work has never been published in a duplicate place, anything like that. If you are on a revise and resubmit, which is what this letter was, you might want to say what you have done to change, kind of a summary of what you've done. I'll talk in just a second more about revise and resubmits. But you just want to say we've found the reviewers' comments helpful, we've changed our paper, etc. So after you've finally submitted your article, it feels like it just kind of ventures into this black hole of nothing. What actually happens is that there is usually a desk or a technical review, so that's the person who's seeing if you actually followed the instructions for authors. Places like JAMA, this is where the vast majority of stuff gets triaged. Then it goes out for peer review by the editor. So it goes out to a number of your peers. You may or may not have suggested reviewers. A lot of times in the submission website, you will suggest a number of reviewers. The reviewers have 2 weeks something to review it. I don't know that there's an average time that it takes. It just always takes forever as the author. So I just generally think forever. When I submit something. The comments are collated then by the editor, and they usually write a summary, and then they will give you the comments, often verbatim, from each one of your reviewers that you are meant to address. And the editor will notify you with a decision letter. So congratulations, this is accepted with minor revisions, this is, etc. And that at that point, you're usually notified via email. So there's different decisions that can happen. Except as is, this hardly ever happens. Except with minor revisions, this happens fairly frequently. So little things that need to be fixed, please deal with, and the reviewers will articulate exactly what you need to deal with. Revise and resubmit, that happens a lot. So if you hit all of these issues that were brought up by the reviewers, we will re-look at your article. We like it enough to give you another chance, but it's not guaranteed that you will get this article published, and then there's a rejection. So I thought it would be most helpful to talk about revise and resubmit and accept with revisions, because these happen quite frequently. Often in your letter from the editor, it will say, here are the deadlines to turn it around. You want to write a detailed letter about the revisions. So what I do is I take every single one of the reviewer comments and I deal with them. Every single one of them. Or if I don't deal with it, I say, here's why I'm not dealing with this. Just because you want to be respectful of them and their time. Sometimes when you're replying, there will also be instructions to authors about how to reply. You just want to make sure that if those exist, you look at those. Do people know PhD Comics? I think it's hilarious. I go down a rabbit hole every time I look at these. There's a language about how you write your comments back. So authors fail to recognize the work of Smith, who solved the same problem 20 years ago. We didn't think anybody actually read that. Their solution was better than ours. Not appropriate. The correct response, the reviewer raises an interesting concern. However, our work is based on completely different first principles, i.e. we use different variable names, and has much more attractive graphical user interface. So, there's a language to writing it. I just wanted to make that point. Plus, I love those comics. So, good. Rejection. Everybody gets rejected, and it is easy, particularly for people who are new to publishing, to feel like that was a soul-crushing experience because you put so much time and effort and heart into that paper. So if you're working with students, really trying to help them, this is not a personal rejection, this has nothing to do with you, we will move forward, and taking those critiques to make it better. I think that one of the most annoying things that has happened to me as a reviewer is I spend hours on a paper reviewing it and trying to make it better and give them really useful suggestions, and then I get it from another journal and they have made none of my suggestions. I'm like, you know what, reject, there you go. Just because your same reviewers are likely going to see your article again, especially if you're in kind of a small, narrow field. So just so that you're aware, not making those changes sometimes can be an editorial choice, but sometimes can be detrimental to your paper.
I have a question about revise and resubmit.
Yeah.
I have a situation right now with that where I have my reviewer comments, I have comments from the editor, and one of the reviewer comments and the editor comment directly conflict.
Oh, yeah.
And so I emailed the editor, because he said it was okay to do that. And I said, in this circumstance, how do I address this?
Yeah.
Because one is, this table is useless, basically, and the other one was, it's great, you need to revise it. So that's a pretty big deal, like
Yeah.
keeping a table.
Yeah,
in
giant
mind.
table,
And
yeah.
so do you give preference to the editor's comments?
I mean, I would, personally, and then I would write in there to the reviewer, you know, thank you so much for your advice about this table. We've really revised it and we believe it's more useful now. You know, and so I would not be like, what's up, we ignored you, for the editor, you know. You are less important, period. Like,
And sometimes it doesn't even go back to the review.
Yeah, it
goes
depends.
Right back to the editor and they decide to accept it or reject it. I've had something come back from the editor and they basically said, ignore reviewer 2 comments, we don't agree. But they had to include them, so I say preference to the
Yeah.
editor.
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Is it typical to get feedback from all journals, whether it's, well, revision, they would, but what about rejection?
It depends. So if it's a desk reject, not usually. But if it went out for peer review, then yes, you should get your comment.
And I've had comments where they say certain things are missing, but they're there in the paper.
So what I often do is I say, you know, something, I mean, effusive, like, thank you for this comment. Please see line 38, page 4 for this, for how we've addressed this issue. We are happy to make this more, or I will say, we made this more clear in the paper, and I will add something to make it more clear, because obviously somebody missed it. You know, for me, I guess same with grant writing, I take the reviewers' comments very, very seriously, even if they've missed something. That means I didn't write it well. Even though it might mean that they're really sleepy and they're just reviewing it late at night.
So I've heard different things about suggesting peer reviewers. There's politics, obviously. People don't want, you know, other people to publish something that they are specialists in. And I've heard mixed. Some people say do it. Some people say don't.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Let them decide.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not an expert in this by any means. I suggest people who I know want to see the science furthered, people who are not egomaniacal. I mean, so if I'm going to suggest a reviewer, I'm not going to suggest somebody who I think will reject my article simply because they're also doing work on teens and trauma. I don't really want them to, I don't know, I mean, that's a stupid reason to reject an article. I want somebody who's going to look at it and be like, the science isn't right yet, you need to fix that, who will make me better. So for me, I'm just talking from my own personal experience, but because of the type of the research that I do, which is like teamwork and trauma, I want, or surgery, I want people who understand the complexities of doing this type of work in this type of environment, not like, for me, a bunch of surgeons who are like, why didn't you do a randomized control trial? And then I have to write back because that's bordering on impossible, you know? So I want people who are gonna be like helpful and friendly and willing to read the paper and give it the value, put some sort of value on it. I don't know if other folks have tactics that they use in suggesting. I do, personally, yeah. I mean, so after having been in the field for a while, you know, I know who is gonna just be a jerk and who's gonna be helpful.
And then does it make the literature less valid because you know the peer reviewers and then they might be helping you out, you know? Does that affect anything?
I mean, I don't know I don't know what I would say broadly for the ethics of it. I think if you have a bad study, no matter how friendly your reviewer is, they're going to be like, that's a bad study. I think that I think also having people review your work who you admire is helpful. Because the whole point in getting reviewer comments is to make your article better. Like, I don't think it's I never think about it as a versus thing. I think about it as a building thing. I'm not sure, I mean, what do other people who review, what do folks think?
I would also think that the journals are trying to increase their pool of reviewers. So you don't want to just pick the people who are, the most well-known in that area or that subject, but branch out a little bit for more junior people that are in the field, but maybe not, as well-known. I don't know.
Yeah.
We have blind
go ahead.
reviews.
Yeah, so there's the other, that's right, thank you. That's the other thing is you may be able to suggest reviewers, but the comments back are blind. So you don't actually know whether they took it or not. They took your suggestion or not.
Is there a list of which journals are in PubMed? Because a lot of my friends are publishing them, like, oh, what's the PubMed citation so I can add it to my EndNote? Oh, it's not in PubMed. To me, it's not going to be well read if it's not in PubMed.
Yeah.
Is there a list of which journals are in PubMed, and is it by impact factor? Is it by?
I actually don't know that. I know that PubMed has a list of all the journals that they have.
I see. So just search that list.
Yeah, but I'm not
And there's a
sure.
process you have to go through to get,
Like a PMID or something.
yeah, you have to go through this process, and they have to review your articles over the last 5 years or what have you. What's the process for getting?
So to get published, hi, I'm Rita, I'm a librarian. So to get into PubMed, and there's over 4,000 journals that have been vetted, and they're vetted by librarians and experts in that particular field. And so that's how you get into, and there's a difference between, and I'm speaking about Medline specifically. If it's been vetted, it's in Medline, and it's been indexed with MESH, medical subject headings.
Yeah.
But there are other things that show up in PubMed as a bigger piece of the pie, which include conference proceedings and book chapters. But conference proceedings and book chapters do not show up in Medline. So if you want it to be vetted, then you want to stick to Medline.
And there's a process that you have to go through, and then they may suggest, like MedEd Portal's going through this whole process right now, and they suggested some sort of restructuring for their author guidelines and some things like that. So they're changing the process for submissions and stuff like that to make it a little bit more rigorous and scientific.
Cool. I was trying to think of ways to be hopeful at the end of this. So I think from doing reading, but also from talking to folks who are prolific publishers, successful researchers, successful publishers write, and they write a lot. And they get rejected a lot. So again, don't let it crush your soul. Just write, because it doesn't necessarily have to be good. I actually looked at a paper that was trying to determine, using like correlation, how the most prolific publishers, like when they wrote and what they did and how many times a week they wrote, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a really neat study, but it was from 1978, so I thought not worth putting up. But one of the things that they pointed out was good people who publish a lot have a routine, they have a habit. They also made the suggestion that writing early in the morning is better than writing late in the evening. People have different things that work for them. But I think the most important thing is writing regardless of whether or not it's going to be good, because it's a skill. I mean, it's just like doing sit-ups. Like, it hurts at the beginning and then you get better at it and it doesn't hurt anymore. So writing hurts in the beginning and it'll get better. I think the idea of enjoying the process to an extent, like enjoying the process of figuring out how am I going to present this information appropriately, and finding it a challenge when you get a rejection. All right, so fine, how am I going to write this better, is helpful. But the result is what you want. The result, and getting an acceptance letter is such a joyful occasion. Asking for help, like asking your colleagues to read it, asking your mentors to read it, asking anybody you can to read it is so important. And don't be embarrassed to ask, because stuff that has only been read by the author is very obvious to a reviewer. There's a couple of articles that I thought were kind of nice. The ICMJE roles and responsibilities for authors. And then this is from Elsevier, 8 Reasons Why I Rejected Your Article. I actually really liked the 8 reasons, so I'm sure these slides will be available and we'll make sure you have those. So thank you all so much, and thanks for your thoughts. And if there's further conversation, we're happy to have it. So thank you.